Hi everyone, it's Isabella. And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons and Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, Character Voices, Part 1. In the Wilds, the Doppleganger. And in the Tavern, what would you do if the party had to disguise themselves?
Hey there, everyone. I hope everybody out there is having an excellent day. Today is, of course, Halloween. And what better way to celebrate the end of Spooky Month by dressing up as one of my favorite characters? Isabella, of course, you would have heard on Plot Hooks Adventures in the second session, episode 2, so labeled PHA 2-2. She's the Hollyphant, which the party encountered in Wraithward, and then in the later episode helped them by teleporting them away. I do apologize if you were expecting me to do that voice for the entire episode, but let's be honest, that episode would be very short. But we do want to talk about character voices today. While there definitely is a lot of LARPing, live-action role-playing, that occurs around tables, in most circumstances, we show up to the table and pretend to be our characters through just our voices and perhaps our actions, like our hand motions and stuff like that. And while our posture, our nonverbal cues, pantomiming certain actions can all be great for role-playing, perhaps the thing which is easiest to use to put your stamp on a particular character is their voice. That's the first thing that your party mates will notice as you roleplay your character. Your voice, your tone. That communicates your mood, it communicates your personality, it communicates so much about you as a character. But at the same time, character voices, while I do think they're important, they are overemphasized. To a negative point, I believe, sometimes. So we just want to talk a little bit about character voices today. This will be part 1 of a series. I do want to have on some guests to actually talk about the way that they stay in a voice and talk about some of their favorite voices to do in a future episode. But for now, we just want to talk about the basics of character voices in general. Before we get into that, though, just some announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on social media. We're at PlotHooks at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Of course, be sure to follow us on Twitter. We're still so close on our quest for 1K to that 700 follower mark, which unlocks the next giveaway. Be sure to rate and review the podcast wherever you happen to listen to it. It helps spread the word to more people. And support us on Patreon. There's lots of content up there available for you, and it helps us keep the lights on around here and be able to keep sharing all of this content with you all. We genuinely appreciate your support, and even if you just listen to the show, thank you so much for being part of the Plot Hooks family. But with that out of the way, let's get into character voices. As I already said in the introduction, I think how you talk is a very important thing. It communicates your current mood, it communicates your personality. Since you aren't, generally speaking, in the character's clothing or anything like that, the impressions that you're giving your party mates or the impression that your NPCs are giving to the party, if you're on the Dungeon Master side of the equation, the first impressions happen through the voice. And so actually speaking in character, using their voice, even if it's not a accent or a different tone or anything like that, just speaking in their voice, being angry if they're angry or being sad if they're sad, that communicates a lot. It's so much more immersive than just talking in the third person, like saying my character name. Let's use Isabella as an example. Isabella says, okay, let's go to the market. Rather than actually saying,
let's go to the market.
You're actually using an excited tone there because Isabella's excited about this potential trip that the party's about to go on. You get to indicate with their posture and their tone and with their voice what their mood is and how they're feeling about the situation. So I think speaking in character voices can really help aid in immersion and role-playing. But at the same time, I think in the current dynamic of Dungeons & Dragons, and perhaps even TTRPGs in general, I think we've gone too far with it. I think with the advent of so many streaming shows and lots of great content out there which have very talented voice actors using all kinds of complicated accents and really intricate voice work, it's set an unfair standard for people, especially people who are just starting out. And to a certain extent, voices have become a little bit of a gatekeeper in some circumstances. People look at using voices and they think, oh, I don't use a voice. I don't know how to do an accent. I might try to do a voice, but then I slip into my normal voice and I can't keep it. And then they think that because of that, they're a bad role player. Or even worse, they look at people doing really talented accents and just say, well, I can't play D&D at all because I don't know how to do a good character voice. And I just want to say, that's not the case at all. Playing Dungeons & Dragons has nothing to do with being great at accents or being great at voices. Even using voices itself does not mean that you have to use a voice that's other than your own. The key thing with character voices is making sure that you speak as the character. That it's not you talking about what your character is saying, and the same thing goes for a DM, that you're not just talking about what your NPC is saying, but that you are actually speaking from the perspective of that character. You're actually getting into their head and speaking in their tone, excited if they were excited, sad if they were sad, and literally playing that role with your voice. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. It doesn't have to be anything that you need acting or improv chops for. So I think on the whole, we've come at character voices from a little bit of the wrong angle. And in so doing, in the emphasis on accents and other things like that, we've turned some people off from being able to express themselves as their character. But again, there's no need for complicated voice work in order to voice your character. It's okay for your character to have your voice. Just speak as your character would in a particular scenario. And that is all the character voice that you need. Now, past this, a lot of us really do enjoy doing certain voices. And maybe you want to get into doing that if you don't do it already. And I'm, of course, not an acting coach or a vocal coach. I can't tell you how to do a good accent. I do terrible accents. But I perhaps can give you a couple of tips as you start towards that process of expressing yourselves with a voice that actually comes out sounding a little bit different than your own. These will be pretty quick fire, but they're just little tips which might help us along on our way. The first is to start with an impersonation. That can be a great way to start a voice, and it can be tweaked as you go along, but you can just start somewhere with a particular impression of somebody that you've seen in a movie, or of a cartoon character, or of one of your friends. And then it can be tweaked as you figure out exactly how the voice wants to sound. But starting with an impression gives you a starting point. It makes it a lot easier than just trying to come up with exactly how this person should sound from scratch. Isabella, for instance, continuing to use her as an example, is a variation of just an Elmo impersonation. And it doesn't even have to be a good impersonation. Just starting with an impression can give you a starting point for your character's voice. Secondly, try changing your pitch. Talking in a high voice or a low voice is an easy adjustment that anybody can make without trying to do a specific accent or trying to talk really gravelly or anything like that. Just talking in your normal voice but lower, or your normal voice but higher, is again a simple way to start. You can take this a little bit further and actually just go down a list of attributes. I first learned about this from a GM tips video that Satine Phoenix did with Taliesin Jaffe a few years ago on Geek and Sundry. When he's DMing, Taliesin says that he's got a couple of lists behind his DM screen. He's got the 7 dwarves from Snow White, and he's got tone, high, medium, or low, and then just the gender of the individual. And any time that a new NPC just pops into the campaign and he doesn't have a voice prepared for them, he just picks one of the dwarves for how the person actually talks, their cadence and whatnot, picks a high, medium, or low voice, and then the gender of the person. By doing that, he's able to generate different kinds of voices for different scenarios. And not only is that just a great tip for GMs to just do, whether that's that exact list or just having a list of accents behind the screen paired with, a list of other traits that you might want to mix and match with. But whenever you're creating a player character, you can just look online and say, okay, what kind of accent might I want to try? And then pick an accent and then say, okay, does this person talk gruff? Is it gravelly? Is it high-pitched? Is it nasally? How do they sound? Picking things off of a list can give you a great start. Thirdly, practice. There's nothing wrong with practicing whenever you're driving, whenever you're in front of a mirror, whenever you're in the shower, talking in your character's voice, saying, okay, how would my character sound if they were angry? How would my character sound if they were sad? Is there a tonal difference there? How would this character sound in this particular scenario? And then practice it. Fourthly, make sure to watch your posture. We've actually talked about this on the show with Sean from Paradise RPG and Shannon as well from Paradise RPG. We've talked about how someone's posture affects the tone of their voice. It affects how you roleplay. And actually being cognizant of your posture as you actually try to speak as your character will actually help the voice come out like you want it to. Slouching if you want to sound really mopey or sad, or standing up straight and holding your head back if you want to sound very uppity and pompous. Posture is a simple but effective thing to getting a voice that's like what you want. And fifthly and finally, just go for it. It's gonna be silly. There's gonna be times where we slip out of an accent, or we do the wrong impersonation, or we mess up, or we start talking in one voice when we meant to do another voice, especially as DMs where we're got so many different voices going on in our heads. Sometimes we might even forget to write down what a certain NPC sounded like, and now all of a sudden they return to the shop you never expected them to, and now you've got to figure out what the voice was so that you can have some sort of continuity. And then you mess up and your party's laughing at you because you're doing a British accent whenever this person actually had a big southern drawl. But that's okay. Go for it. Be goofy. If you're at the right table, the people that are around with you telling collaborative stories alongside you are there to support you. It's true that speaking in your character's voice or trying to do accents or doing things like that can be embarrassing. And you certainly don't have to do it if you're not ready. You certainly don't ever have to do it at all. Again, I don't think it's a necessary thing for role-playing. I think speaking in your character's voice is quite helpful, but that doesn't have to be an accent. That doesn't have to be some sort of complicated voice. And as a quick aside, let's make sure as fellow role-players that we don't force others to do voices when they're not comfortable with it yet. So if you don't want to do that, you never have to. Personally, though, I think it's fun. And while it is embarrassing, and I don't always continue in my voices because I get embarrassed, if we push through and face that fear, there's a lot of fun to be had. But we'll return to this topic with some guests on a later episode, so I look forward to revisiting this topic with you then. So what kind of voices have been your favorite? What's your favorite that someone in your group has ever done? What's your favorite that you've ever done? Make sure to tell us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. But I think without further ado, it's about time for us to hop on Isabella's back and get teleported out into the wilds. Alright, we're out here in the wilderness, and continuing in this Halloween spooky month theme, what better creature to look at than a creature which is the best in Dungeons & Dragons at disguising itself, doppelgangers. At their core, doppelgangers are shapeshifters. Their natural form is this hairless blue humanoid, looks almost like a Vidalkin from Magic the Gathering lore, but they're almost never found in this form unless they're slain, at which point in time they revert to their true form. But they travel around all over the place. Every culture, every continent, they will take on the guise of any humanoid person. And this makes them a terrifying foe. They're not very powerful, only a challenge rating 3, only 52 hit points with an armor class of 14, but what makes them so scary is just the fact that you never know who they are. Because they can literally look perfectly like any small or medium humanoid. And whenever it decides to turn its back on you, it can get you. Because it has two features, one called Ambusher and one called Surprise Attack. The Ambusher says, in the first round of a combat, the doppelganger has advantage on attack rolls against any creature it surprised. And Surprise Attack says that if the doppelganger surprises a creature and hits it with an attack during the first round of combat, the target takes an extra 10 or 3d6 damage from the attack. The flavor of this is, typically speaking, you're all of a sudden going to be attacked by someone that you know. You're going to be attacked by someone who you had no idea that this was an enemy. This doesn't look like an enemy. This looks like your tavern keep. This looks like your blacksmith. This looks like, heck, even one of your friends. And all of a sudden, it starts attacking you. And if it does that and just attacks out of nowhere and the party is surprised, then it gets advantage on all of its attacks rolls, and its attacks do an extra 3d6. That's very powerful for a challenge rating 3. To make matters even harder, doppelgangers can also read minds. Their read thought action allows it to read the surface thoughts of any one creature within 60 feet of it, and it can even penetrate some barriers, up to 3 feet of wood or dirt, 2 feet of stone, 2 inches of metal, or a thin sheet of lead. Anything less than that of those materials, and it can read minds straight through a barrier. And there's no save or anything like that. It's just reading your thoughts. So before you even understand that this entity is a doppelganger, it is there gaining information about you and about what you think of it. And it can use this information to, while it's reading the target's mind, it gains advantage on insight checks and deception, intimidation, and persuasion checks against the target. And as long as the target is in range, it keeps reading your mind until it wants to stop, just like it's concentrating on a spell. All these things make them the perfect ambush monster and the perfect monster to really just create some chaos with your party. Out of nowhere, this person they thought was an NPC is just easily able to just attack them out of nowhere and put them in real danger. However, these things aren't without their limits, and this means that a doppelganger actually has to put in some work in order to do an accurate impersonation. While it can blend into any sort of crowd visually, the polymorph that it uses doesn't let it learn different languages or mannerisms or figure out anything specific about the creature that it wants to impersonate. So a lot of times, doppelgangers will actually follow the person that they're going to try to take the place of for a while, continuing to do that mind read effect and figuring out certain things in order to be able to behave in a manner which will fool everyone around them. That's a really interesting hook for a party. Maybe a doppelganger is wanting to infiltrate this particular group. So maybe they try to latch themselves onto the group and follow them around. All the while, it's actually reading their minds and figuring things out about them in order to use against them later. At higher levels, they can even be encountered in groups. Perhaps even impersonating an entire king's court. Becomes almost Marvel Skrull-esque at that point. And if you do that, it can actually become an arc of a campaign instead of just a really interesting and intricate monster to throw at a party to surprise them and really freak them out and to give them some mystery perhaps about these things have been happening around this person and they're not sure who it is because they trust this person. There's lots of different things to do with just an individual, but whenever you start talking about a whole group of them, now you're talking about a whole campaign arc. In another vein, I also like the idea of a part doppelganger player character. That's because, according to the monster manual, doppelgangers don't raise their own young. What they do is they take the form of a male and then they seduce women of different cultures, and then once their child is born, they leave. Because a doppelganger kid just looks like the normal kid that the mother would have typically had until it starts to mature. Once it's an adolescent, it figures out what it really is, and a desire awakens within them to go seek out its own kind. I think a really interesting idea is a player character that has that desire in them. They are part doppelganger, which means, in all intents and purposes, they're a doppelganger. But perhaps they don't want to be a doppelganger. So you use the stats of whatever race you happen to appear to be. You just use halfling stats or dragonborn stats or whatever. But part of your backstory is that you have this struggle, this internal struggle where you want to go seek out your own kind, but you refuse to because you love your mother, you love your people, and you don't want to become like those of your kind. I think that could be a really interesting character. But whether you're incorporating them like that, or just surprising a party by a quick betrayal, doppelgangers provide a lot of opportunity for great collaborative storytelling. But I think that's about all the time we have in the wilds today. Let's head back over to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook. What would you do if the party had to disguise themselves? Of course, this is staying in the Halloween theme, putting on costumes. Personally, I really like this idea because it's a little bit of a lost art in Dungeons & Dragons. The prevalence of sneaky characters, the prevalence of magical abilities that allow you to disguise yourself with the literal disguise self spell or with even more powerful magics, make having to disguise themselves physically a little bit obsolete. But I think having to disguise yourself physically is a great little character thing to throw into a session. There is, of course, the disguise kit, which allows you to roll to create disguises for yourself. And if you're proficient in it, you get to add your proficiency modifier to the roll. And I think physical things like this can create really interesting story opportunities. So what we can do is we can create a scenario where the other options aren't possible. Perhaps they're supposed to be attending a ball in order to speak to a certain individual. And the place is so heavily guarded and so well sealed that there's no way to sneak in. And the place has an anti-magic field on it, which prevents abilities like Disguise Self. So if they don't want to just walk in as themselves, the party has no choice but to create a physical disguise. Another way to force this to happen is perhaps to make the party aware somehow that a particular creature or entity they're going to be interacting with has true sight. True sight, of course, lets you see through any illusion, lets you see anything that's fake or phony like that, but at least the way that I read the ability, it lets you read through all those enchantments and stuff like that. But it doesn't seem to me like it has to mean that you see through physical disguises. It talks about how you can see things as they truly are. And I would personally argue that a physical disguise is what you truly are. You know, you aren't changing anything magically. It's no different than putting on makeup. You're just putting on a lot of makeup. You're putting on, extra makeup and false noses and different things like that. But it's still something physical. It's something real. So I think if you are going to play it this way and you decide to let your characters in through a hint about the idea of a potential creature that they are encountering having true sight, maybe they then have to try to come at it from a physical disguise standpoint rather than trying to make a magical disguise. And I just think that having the players do this adds a little bit of variety to gameplay. It's something that they don't normally have to do. It makes them think outside the box and come up with a new and creative solution, and oftentimes can be just hilarious to see how they disguise themselves. I haven't had the chance to do this in a game myself, but I really want to try. I really want to get a chance to do this sometime. I think it would be both funny and provide a great, unique storytelling opportunity. But I think, with that said, and with the end of Spooky Month now upon us, it's time for us to close out this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks very much for listening. Be sure to check out Plot Hooks Adventures, check out our Patreon, check out our Quest for 1K, and as always, thanks from me, Samuel, and Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.